Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you've ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. Since 2009, our radio program hosted guest experts from around the globe sharing their perspectives, experiences, and expertise while giving you food for thought. If you can't listen live, then download and listen to any of our 300-plus podcasts in our library at texasconflictcoach.com. So sit back, relax, or join the conversation every Tuesday evening, or tweet us at TXConflictCoach.
Well, good evening, everyone. We are going to be talking with Jeff Drucker, who is the author of The 21st Century Disputes, Caveman Brains. How do we bridge the gap? That's tonight's episode. So you've seen it before, and you'll see it again. Someone digs in their heels and adamantly refuses to admit they're wrong, even though the evidence is clearly against them. Or someone devotes far more resources to trying to defeat someone than they can possibly recover, even if they win. Or what about this one? Someone gets into a heated disagreement with a relative or coworker about how to address a situation, even though they are not sure what they really want. What's going on? Well, our minds evolved to deal with differences in the small, simple, homogeneous communities our ancestors occupied thousands of years ago. So they are easily confused and overwhelmed by the complexities of life. We cannot alter how our minds work, but we can learn to overcome their limitations. Now, in our episode, again, it's the 21st Century Disputes, and actually the name of the book is called Resolving 21st Century Disputes, Best Practices for a Fast-Paced World. And Jeff Drucker is the author and our guest for tonight. He has addressed disputes from the perspective of a lawyer, mediator, teacher, trainer, and designer of dispute resolution programs. Jeff, again, wrote this book as a way to fill key gaps that he saw in our understanding of how disputes arise and get resolved. He is currently managing the healthcare dispute resolution program for the American Health Lawyers Association. Now, I already see that we have a caller online, we have someone in the chat room, and we have our Twitter feed going on. So first of all, live callers, we are taking you. If you have a comment or question for the live callers, just press number 1 to let me know that you have a question or comment, and we'll be taking that throughout the show. Again, guests, thank you for joining us in the chat room. If you have comments or questions there, you can just post that. And if you're listening, you want to get into the chat room, you just simply go to blogtalkradio.com/Texas, all spelled out, -conflict-coach, and you'll see the show is playing. Scroll down, you'll see the chat room. And for those who are in the Twitter world, we're using hashtag TCC Radio, and you can engage with us that way as well. So we're just engaging everyone today. Jeff, aren't we?
That's great. And first of all, I want to thank you for having me on the show, and I really want to thank people for listening in and tweeting in and whatever other technology you're using or listening to this months from now. This is a subject that is obviously very important to me. I'm passionate about it, and it's so great to have other people to engage with in this conversation who also get how important learning how to resolve disputes effectively can be for helping us in our personal and professional lives.
Yay. Well, very, very good. You know, I enjoyed every single page of your book. I read your book, and, you know, being in the conflict resolution myself for 20 years, it was wonderful what you wrote about the unconscious and conscious mind and how that interplays and how we see conflicts and resolve them in the 21st century. And so I loved the real-life examples. You had so many real-life examples and wonderful strategies. So what motivated, or what was the motivation for you writing this book, Resolving 21st Century Disputes?
I didn't actually start out to write this book. The motivation came from the very first class I took in conflict resolution, which actually was 1990. It's getting to be a long time ago. And the professor said, and this is obvious, it's sort of one of these sort of obvious truths, but the only place in which disputes arise and can get resolved is the human mind. And I thought, okay, that's really a great insight, but where's the book that tells me how that all happens? And, there's bits and pieces of it in a lot of books about conflict resolution, but I never saw that book, so I decided several years ago, I'm going to write that book. And that's what I set out to do, to take the social science research that explores this subject and put it into a user-friendly way coupled with best practices. Along the way, I discovered this whole area of what's called evolutionary psychology that talks about the human mind, understanding it as a tool to solve a problem. And the problem was to help our ancestors who lived in these small, stable, homogeneous communities thousands of years ago to survive. And if you think of the brain as a tool to do that, then it helps you understand how it works. And I'm reading that, and I realized, wow, that makes sense, but our world today is so different. And so I started looking at the ways that our world is different from that world and how our brain gets confused and overwhelmed and blown off course by those differences that it's not prepared to recognize and deal with.
I'm glad that you talked about that motivation, and I'm also, when you first think about what you're saying here, it's like, okay, is this a really analytical book? Is this, over our heads kind of book? And when I was reading it, again, I was really impressed with how you took that evolutionary psychology, how you took that social science research and made it very practical, written for the everyday person, whether it was a work example, a litigation example, a neighbor example. So say more about kind of the theme of this book and how it's intended to help the listener. If you've got any specific examples, that would be helpful too.
Yeah, well, sure. And my goal was not to impress people in academia. It's to help people. The greatest feedback I could ever get about this book, and fortunately I've had some opportunity, is for somebody to say, I read it, I used it, and it made a difference in my life. Mm-hmm. So first of all, one thing about the book, it's designed to cover universals, and meaning that these are characteristics of human beings regardless of age, race, gender, national origin, religion, upbringing, anything like that. And there's a quote right at the beginning of the book from Maya Angelou, which says, "We are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike." Mm-hmm. And that's really a theme. Like we're, to an extent, we're all kind of struggling with the same problems with the same tools. So one example would be that underlying really all human cooperation is a very, very simple set of emotions that we call tit for tat, or our innate sense of fairness. And those emotions tell us that if somebody does something that is beneficial to us, that we ought to do something equally beneficial for them. Now, we don't always act on those instincts. That's another story. But we feel those emotions. And if somebody harms us in some way, we feel that we ought to harm them back in equal proportion. Again, we don't always act on it, but it's there. Why? Because those emotions make it beneficial for people to cooperate, because you're rewarded if you do something good and you're punished if you do something bad. Now, in a primitive society, people engaged day in and day out with the same small group of people throughout their life. So every action set a precedent. You couldn't allow somebody to do something wrong to you and not get them back, or they continue to exploit you. Well, fast forward to the 21st century, and we have many casual relationships. We sometimes interact with people we've never actually met in person. We don't even know their names. And we've got these emotions that are geared up for this primitive society. Classic example, as I was putting the PowerPoint slides together for the very first time I presented about the book, and the picture that I came out with to illustrate this is road rage. So you're driving down the highway, somebody cuts you off, and you feel, I got to get this person back. Well, you don't know who they are. You'll probably never see them again, and you don't know why they did it. people literally kill themselves. So I put this presentation together. I get in the car to pick up my stepdaughter at school, and I'm in this line of cars trying to get on this access ramp, and somebody cuts right in front of me. And you know what, Patty? If there had been that surface-to-surface missile on my car, I'm not sure. And I started laughing, and after the anger, and I said, you know what? We're never going to get better. These emotions are never going to go away. But what we need to learn to do, and this isn't something we talk about a lot in conflict resolution, is 4 simple words: let go and move on. What we tend to talk about in our field is trying to bring people together so that they can develop a mutual understanding and reach some type of agreement. And there are a lot of situations in which that's a wonderful thing to do. But there are also a lot of situations in life in which that's just not going to happen. It's impossible or impractical. And the best we can do is just say, there's nothing I can accomplish by continuing this. I'm just going to move on. Our courts are filled with cases in which somebody is pursuing a case or defending a case, and they are putting more time and resources into it than they can possibly get out of it. And that is an enormous drain on our society. And it's motivated by those simple, primitive emotions. If people get nothing out of this program other than just being more present to when they're feeling that sense of, I need to get the other person back, recognizing the source of that emotion, and then asking yourself, is that really going to serve my needs? It can be extremely emotionally unsatisfying to just say, all right, I'm going to let go and move on. But I am very, very present from sort of having written this book and feeling like I got to live up to it, to the situations that happen in all parts of my life where that's just the right thing to do. And now I just kind of laugh at those emotions that are pushing me the wrong way, let go, move on, and just deal with conflict, I think, a lot more effectively than I used to. So that's...
Go ahead.
Oh, so that's one example. Do you want me to go on and give another, or did you want to break for something?
Yeah, let me just respond to that if you don't mind. And, when we hear people say, let go and move on, I can already hear some listeners already saying, let go and move on, I'm not going to let go. I mean, their sense of, like you said, that harm or getting back or fairness is stronger than maybe in their mind they're like, well, that is my need. It's going to serve my need already if I can get them back. And what they don't realize is that the cost of that is probably much higher. And you gave the example of court cases, and we've heard in the news and media, we hear hundreds of examples over the years of where people, feel like they're the victim. They go to court, they think they're going to win big, and then they realize that they lose big actually, and they paid more than they could ever get back, kind of like what we said in our opening. But I guess the question that comes to me is, when we talk about letting go and moving on, that's a really hard thing to do. And at what point is it more important to not move on? I mean, so there's that real fine balance, of if letting go and moving on, how do you do that? And when do you say to yourself, I can't let go, and it's important to not move on and to stay where I'm at? I mean, I'm not saying that you have the answer to that, but that's what's coming up for me.
Well, it comes up case by case. But the thing is, if you ask yourself the question, what really is going to serve my interest better? Just by doing that, then you'll come up with the answer. The problem is that we often don't really ask ourselves the question. We just let the emotions rule. And by the way, there's this wonderful example of this in the movie. It's called 42. It's about Jackie Robinson. And for those who may not know, he was the first African-American baseball player in the National League and professional leagues. And when Branch Rickey is talking about who he's looking for, whether Jackie Robinson is the right person, and he talks about all of the abuse that he would have to take and not respond to it. And Jackie Robinson says, so you want somebody who doesn't have the guts to fight back. And Branch Rickey says, no, I want to have somebody who has the guts not to fight back. And it's just such a powerful line. And Jackie Robinson literally changed America by not fighting back. It must have been phenomenally hard for him to do it, but he changed America by exercising that restraint.
Oh, I love that story. Thank you for sharing that. Now, you said you had another example.
Well, let's talk about change. So,
okay.
This is obviously a big issue in today's world because our world is changing very quickly, and our ancestors had developed, as we have inherited, an amazing ability to adapt to change because things would happen and they just had to learn how to deal with them. But things happen to them. Today, we often find ourselves in situations in which we are given a choice. Somebody is trying to enlist us, or we are trying to enlist somebody else in agreeing to some type of new experience that they haven't been in before. A common example is at work. You're asking people to do something in a way that they haven't done it before, or take on new tasks or responsibilities, or in a family situation, one family member feels they need to move to a different city for a job, and they're asking the other family members to support them in doing it. So we're then asked to imagine how we're going to feel about a situation that we've never been in before. Not to adapt to it, but to predict. We literally do not have a mental tool for doing that. So our predictions are usually way off. What we tend to do is wildly exaggerate how happy or sad some change is going to make us feel, and not take into account how well we're going to adapt. So one of the examples is from, as you may know, I was involved in the development of the redress program, workplace mediation program at the U.S. Postal Service, and we needed to enlist managers who were used to barking orders at their employees to go into mediation. Well, there was a huge amount of resistance. Now, the first group of people, admittedly, were basically dragged into it kicking and screaming.
Yeah, I can imagine.
That's one way you get people to adapt. But many of those managers initially did, they ultimately became converts to the program. Now, when we rolled the program out from one pilot site around the country, the way we did it is, first of all, a video, because people can't predict how they feel, but if they give a chance to experience the change, even secondhand, it can help them see, oh, yeah, I can do this. So the video gives them a sense of what this is going to look like, and then they can imagine themselves there. And then we would bring in those supervisors who would tell the story about how they fought this tooth and nail. They thought it was the worst thing in the world, and then they talk about how they went into the mediation, what a positive experience they had. They were the best salespeople because the people who were being sold on it could relate to them. They were peers, so they could relate to the experience. So the message there is, first of all, it's hard for us to be able to predict accurately when somebody makes this demand or request on us to change. And the best way to help somebody do that is to give them some opportunity, directly or indirectly, to experience what the change is like so they can feel what it's like. And that's what helps our brains get an accurate picture.
Okay, I love that. I love that strategy. All right, so for those who are just tuning in, you are listening to the Texas Conflict Coach Blog Talk radio program, and I'm speaking with Jeff Drucker, author of Resolving 21st Century Disputes. And so we've talked a little bit about the basis and motivation behind the book, and now what we're getting ready to do is talk about some, before we go into practical advice, I'll see if there's any other thoughts that you still wanted to share, but the question is what is the practical advice? I mean, you just gave one just now, especially around predictability. For us, it's hard to change and predict accurately what will happen to change. And the strategy you mentioned was how do we give people an opportunity to feel what that big picture experience would be like as a way to give them an opportunity to experience the change. What is other practical advice you can give on how we manage or resolve our disputes in this, in this very chaotic, and that was something you really talked about in your book, is that in today's world compared to the caveman world, we've become a very chaotic world in the sense that our information that we have access to, it's very information-packed through LinkedIn and Twitter and the Internet, and so we're overwhelmed with choices and decisions, and so how do we manage that in today's world as far as managing, resolving conflicts? What are some, and you had tons and tons and tons of strategies, but let's talk maybe about 3 of them or so.
Okay. Well, one of the other subjects to talk about is conscious decision-making. You mentioned all the information we have. One of the ironies of our 21st century society is that we actually use our intuition, our gut instinct, to make decisions more than ever. And the reason is because we know more and more about less and less. If you think about it, the information that we use to write down information 100 years ago was a pen. Everybody understood how it worked. Now the tool we use is a computer. Like 0.001% of our population knows how that works. So when you're buying a computer, you actually have to use some sort of intuitive heuristic for how to do that, because how would you know? I mean, you can't just look at the computer and understand how it works. So one of the strategies is to recognize, if you're trying to make decisions, that we have a huge number of options these days, and often we have trouble understanding them. And one of the mantras in the field of dispute resolution has tended to be that we empower people by giving them more and more options. And the social science research actually shows that we can handle at most about 6 options. That's all our brains can wrap themselves around. And often, if you want to help people resolve it, what you need to do is try to find ways for them to narrow down the number of options to a manageable number. And then also recognize whether we can really understand this or we need to make a guess. And I'll just give one example. Even though there's only 2 options, I'm a cancer survivor. I had leukemia several years ago, and there were 2 courses of treatment that were available for me. And my father is a doctor. He did all the legwork for me. He narrowed it down, and then we had this conversation. Just to give context, I was given, at best, a 40% chance of survival. And so this is a critical decision between 2 courses of treatment, and he described them, and then he stopped. And I said, okay, Dad, which one should I do? And he said, Jeff, I don't know. He said, there just isn't any research. I can't tell you which one's better. So there I was making literally the most important decision in my life, and I just had to guess. I went with the one which just felt better.
So your gut.
I'm here to talk about it, but that's often, and people face this with an elderly parent. You've got 4 siblings arguing about what to do and trying to figure out the right answer, and often people will get on the Internet, and, at some point, you're just going to have to go with your gut. People face it with pets. People face it with children, where we have to make medical decisions. Sometimes it's financial decisions. These days there can be a zillion and one options. They're all very complicated. They're hard to predict how they're going to work out, and that can be an enormous source of gut-wrenching conflict. And so 2 very simple pieces of advice: narrow down the options as much as you can, and don't be afraid to just go with your gut feeling. The social science research confirms that in highly complex decision-making, people actually make better decisions when they use their intuition than when they try to sort through facts that are just too overwhelming and complex to get through.
Well, we're blessed to have you in this world today, and you taking the time, the energy, the commitment, your intuition in the research and producing this wonderful piece of work that's going to be very helpful to so many of the listeners. And the fact of you giving back, to the community to help them. I mean, I can imagine all the people that were there for you, your family, strangers, the hospital, the doctors, and helping you live and survive. and yet you're doing the same thing for others. I know you don't compare it to, death and dying, but for some people, this could be and really involve their life. Like you said, when people make decisions about their elderly parents or a sick child or any number of things that go on. So we're very blessed to have you in this world today. Thank you for sharing that. That's a very vulnerable thing to talk about. But I'm also glad that you said that, because even as a conflict resolution practitioner, I've heard that same mantra as well. You brainstorm lots of options, you look at all those things, but then people get so confused and it's chaotic and overwhelmed, and then they kind of get stuck. And then they might even start to shut down in the conversation. So this is new information even for me about, how do we narrow the choices down, because our brains can only handle those particular choices, and also to rely on that gut instinct. Any other practical advice that you want to talk about? We still have a few more minutes left, and then we'll start talking about our assignment for the week.
Well, I noticed in the introduction you talked about anxiety, and that's something that also is very important to understand. We have our anxiety instinct is designed to combat violent attacks. And in nature, if you're attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, there's really not a lot of opportunity for negotiation and collaboration. You can take one leg, but please leave me the other one. It's not going to really work.
Exactly.
And the other thing to note about primitive societies is they were vastly more violent than our society. So even a conflict with another human being had a high probability of relating to violence. So our minds are wired up for the fight. We call it the fight or flight instinct. And what happens is, on an emotional level, we lose our ability to feel any emotion other than anger or fear, which anger motivates fight, fear motivates flight. And on a conscious level, we lose the ability to reason, to speak. That's another skill of the conscious mind, and to be able to think about other options besides just fight or flight. So very important, very simple advice for dealing with a situation that produces anxiety is to step back before those emotions, anger and fear, overwhelm, and before that your brain literally shuts down. I mean, if you've heard people talk about being in conflict, being scared, speechless, or scared out of their wits, those are literally accurate observations about what happens. So step back from it, and then find a way to engage with the other person, and it may involve a mediator or a facilitator of some kind to do it in a way that's going to produce less anxiety. A lot of what people in the conflict resolution field give to two parties is the ability to engage in a less anxiety-producing environment. We can literally think better when we're less anxious. And that openness that people can have to options other than flight, which is either literally fleeing or I'm not going to talk to you, or fight, which can be either violence or yelling, obscenities at the other person. The ability to envision those options as possible and feel those emotions that would push us to come up with a compromise or collaboration of some kind, those increase when we're less anxious. And so just being focused on understanding that dynamic and looking for ways to minimize your own and the other person's anxiety can be extremely effective tools. And one that people don't use nearly enough is to set ground rules for a conversation, meaning that people agree not to yell and scream at each other, not to interrupt, to stay on a certain subject or avoid other subjects. I mean, imagine a parent and a teenager before they have that conversation about the kids staying out too late, just saying, hey, how about we have this conversation, I listen to you, you listen to me, and we'll do it respectfully, and then we'll talk about how we can deal with it, rather than just getting into it and then one person starts in, the other person escalates, and the whole thing explodes. That's that's a simple tip that I really feel is just dramatically underused in our lives.
Well, great. Those are three great strategies. Step back, then engage the other person with or without another kind of third party that can help them with that and establish some ground rules. So many people underestimate the value and the criticalness of ground rules. So great practical advice. So folks that are in the chat room, on the call, in the Twitter feed, if you have any last-minute comments or questions, here's your opportunity to let me know that. If you're in the chat room, you can type that out there. If you're in the call-in room, you can certainly press number 1 if you have a comment or question that we can address right quick before we start to close. Now, you have an assignment. We have an assignment for the week. We do that every show. We try to encourage listeners to take the next step, to be, listening to the show and then say, okay, what's the next thing to motivate them? So what do you have for our listeners today?
Okay. Well, this is a questionnaire that's designed for people who are involved in an ongoing dispute of some kind. And the questions are not about figuring out who is right or wrong, and it's only partly about interests, which is often what we focus on in the field. It tries to get much more into, primarily about the thinking and emotions that are behind the conflict. And if people are going to focus on anything at all, I would say questions 3 and 4 are probably the most important, because they get at identity, what this conflict says about, or you feel says about you, and what the other person feels it says about him or her. I don't think you can ever, Patty, overemphasize the importance of identity as a driver of human behavior, particularly with respect to dispute resolution, because disputes tend to really threaten our identity. And that threat and that sense of needing to either restore our identity or protect it is a huge driver of how we respond to the situation. So getting questions that try to help us really focus in on that can really help people to develop new insights into a situation that they're dealing with, and new sense of how that situation might best be resolved.
I'm so glad you talked about that piece about identity, because you had a great chapter just about that whole piece of identity. So I'm glad you pointed out questions 3 and 4. And folks, it is a PDF document. It's located at texasconflictcoach.com on the program show page, so you can download that PDF form to use as you think about disputes that really bother you, and that's questions number 3 and 4. Now, Jeff, you had mentioned earlier that you were putting some PowerPoint presentations. Do you have presentations or workshops around this topic that's coming up anytime soon that you want people to know about?
Well, there's a program on law and psychology, actually, that's coming up in February. So that's probably the next big one that I'll be presenting at.
Okay. And any other workshops or anything you want people to know about that you're doing? Like public
not
workshops?
At this time.
Okay.
Not at this time, but if people can check on jeffdrucker.com, I always post events that are coming up.
Okay, and so, folks, that is Jeff, and that's GEOFF, Drucker, DRUCKER.com. His website is also on his program show page. That will be up there indefinitely, so all this information will remain. And certainly if you want to re-listen to this show, you'll be able to download this episode and re-listen to it as well. All right, I don't think we have any last-minute comments or questions at this point, but I appreciate listeners, you turning in tonight live, or those in the chat room and our Twitter feed. Jeff, what final message do you want to leave with our listeners tonight?
Dispute resolution, I look at it as a skill, just like playing a musical instrument or a sport. Everybody has natural ability, and everybody can get better with practice, no matter how much natural ability they have. And to me, our ability to resolve disputes effectively has a profound impact on the quality of our life. So it's worth taking the time to learn those skills and practice those skills. And to me, it's a lifetime journey I'm always trying to work on it and get better, and having the opportunity to share what I've learned in the field on your show and hopefully make a difference in other people's lives. And again, that's my goal. If even one person who's listening to this broadcast is able to take some of this information and use it to make a difference in their life, I will just be so pleased. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be on your show.
Oh, Jeff, you're very, very welcome. We feel incredibly blessed to have had you, and our listeners, they gain so much value from our guests like yourself. So thank you for being here. Listeners, thank you for joining us, and y'all have a good night.
Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you've enjoyed the program. You can find over 300 podcasts archived to listen at your own convenience at texasconflictcoach.com or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. To learn about upcoming radio programs and resources, sign up for our monthly e-newsletter.